Hello and most welcome to 1106, and we will continue with the new look at Heraclitus of Charles H. Kahn. We're at page 197, first column, and we were talking about here, the paragraph. Here again, the second paragraph of the left column. Here again, Heraclitus is reformulating the Milesian view in the light of his principle of the total unity of things. Thus he insists upon seeing community above all at those points where contrast and discord are most evident, namely in opposites. Each of his references to the harmony or unity of opposites exemplifies from a different point of view that common order in virtue of which all things are one. But this unity is never seen as purely rational and abstract, and in reinterpreting Anaximander's doctrine of cosmic justice, Heraclitus has in fact endowed it with a richer human resonance and a more apocalyptic sense. When he states that if the sun should ever overstep his measures, the erroneous ministers of justice will find him out. The invocation of the Furies gives their mistress Dike a mythical concreteness and an immediate human significance in terms of crime and punishment, for which there is no parallel in the Milesian conception of cosmic justice. It is not merely that Heraclitus has a more poetic style than Anaximander. The foremost speech points to that unity between the life of man and the order of nature, which is at the center of all his thought. The same may be said of the enigmatic phrase 120. The bounds of dawn and evening are the bear, and the opposite the bear, the warder of bright Zeus. End of quote. The bounds or goals of dawn and evening must be the points of the horizon which correspond to the limits of the annual variation, sunrise and sunset, what later authors call the summer and winter risings and settings. These turning points, for that is the normal sense of termata, mark the horizontal measure of the sun's course. How they are indicated by the bear and the warder is not clear, but I conjecture that Heraclitus is alluding to some ancient astronomical technique for plotting the sun's annual course among the stars. It has apparently not been remarked that the warder, Urus, opposite the bear, Arctos, can only be the bear warder, Arctourus, i.e. the Arcturus in Boetes. The precise astronomical link between these constellations and the mention of dawn and evening remains obscure, but the real meaning is perfectly clear. The faultless regularity of the sun's course is again expressed in the mythic terms, by reference to astral watchmen appointed by Zeus to guard the polar constellation. If Zeus here is called Aetherios, Zeus of the bright sky, the title reflects the fact that for Heraclitus, the ruling wisdom of the universe is not to be identified with every man Zeus, not with the philandering, hen-pecked husband portrayed by Homer, but only with the cosmic powers symbolized by fire and by the thunderbolt which pilots all things. 4. Nomos. Nomos, the one in the city of men. Developing from a different point of view, his reinterpretation of Milesian cosmology as a paradigm for the order in man's own life, Heraclitus expounds a conservative and aristocratic political view, of which the historical details escape us, but whose fundamental principle is as fertile for the future as it is independent of any particular philosophical position. The conception of law as the social and human expression of the rational order of nature is perhaps the most influential single idea in the history of political theory, accepted by Plato as the philosophic foundation for his last and longest work, developed by Stoics in conscious imitation of Heraclitus, transmitted to the Roman and medieval world by Cicero's eloquent exposition in the De Legibus. The doctrine of natural law eventually gave birth to the principle of natural rights, and thus provided a justification of the American Declaration of Independence, as well as for the French proclamation of the rights of man and citizen. In the course of this development, the concept of law has undergone important changes, above all under the influence of Roman and Hebraic notions of lawmaking. Our ideas of law tend to reflect either the divine lawgiver of the Old Testament or the Roman conception of lex as a precise verbal formula. Neither notion is relevant to an understanding of what Heraclitus says about nomos in fragments 44, 33 and 114. And in course of this development, the concept of law has undergone important changes, above all under the influence of Roman and Hebraic notions of lawmaking. Our ideas of law tend to reflect either the divine lawgiver of the Old Testament or the Roman conception of lex as a precise verbal formula. Neither notion is relevant to an understanding of what Heraclitus says about nomos in fragments 44 and 33 and 114. The early Greek sense of nomos is that of a traditional order of custom and usage, normative of course and theoretically derived from the gods, but sanctioned above all by time and habit. Heraclitus wrote when this archaic conception of nomos was undergoing change in two directions. On the one hand, the new importance of written law codes drawn up under democratic pressure was given rise to the view of law as a rational, man-made standard. On the other hand, increased knowledge of and interest in the traditions of other lands tended to give nomos, or more frequently the plural nomoi, the relative sense of mores, the conventional pattern of life of a particular community. This interest in what we may call comparative sociology is clearly evidenced in Xenophon's reference to the religious customs of Thrace in Ethiopia, or in the contemporary researches of the world traveler Heraclitus. It is easy to see how such comparisons between different cultures would tend to erode the traditional view of nomos as God-given and sacrosanct. These two trends, sociological relativism and the reformist tendency to regard law as man-made, converge in the late 5th century in the classic antithesis between physis and nomos, nature and convention. Very important. Heraclitus is faced not with the antithesis, but with the trend that produced it, and his own reaction is to resist them both in the name of the divine unity of the cosmos. More exactly, he resists democracy as such, but cultural relativism only insofar as it tends to deny the ultimate validity of law. His notion that nomoi of men, different as they may be, are all nourished by the divine, has its root in the old mythic view which sees society, nature and the gods as only different aspects of a single undivided realm. The philosophical achievement of Heraclitus is to have preserved this mythic sense of coherence between man and nature while giving it a rational form. He does so by linking the civic community to the universal principle of what is common in nature, thus relating the pattern of nomos to the rational structure of the logos, and to reason itself, nous. Like Solon, Heraclitus sees that the moral existence of civic community depends upon a shared framework of custom and law, just as its physical existence depends upon the defense of its city wall. Hence stasis or civil war, like hybris or individual violence, is recognized as the disaster which destroys the civilized life of man. Heraclitus goes beyond Solon, however, in grounding this sociological justification of law and order in a philosophic principle which is fundamental and universal. Rational comprehension, nous, is the knowledge of what is common, xenos, hence the nomos of the human community is a direct expression of the divine, that is, of the rational unity of the world. Not only the individual man, but society too is a microcosm, a reduced model of the world order. Like the soul, the city has a structure of which one cannot find the limits, since it draws its strength and nourishment from the eternal structure of the universe. 5. Psychology and theology. For Heraclitus, more than for most thinkers, the question of deity is inseparable from that of the human souls. Immortals are mortal, mortals immortal, living the other's death, dead in the other's life. We shall see that this paradox points to what is most essential in Heraclitus' view of the life and of man and God. Heraclitus had inherited from his Ionian predecessor a physical view of the psyche as the life breath, the power of breath within us, as well as the concrete air we breathe. That is what Anaximenes must have meant by identifying the soul with air. Heraclitus too sometimes think of the psyche in purely physical or elemental terms, as we see from fragment 36. For souls it is death to become water, for water it is death to become earth. Out of earth water rises, out of water soul. End of quote. What does this imply for the physical constitution of the psyche? It is commonly held that when Heraclitus says soul, here we must understand him to mean fire. But such a view can be justified only by the modern assumption that Heraclitus recognizes only three elements: earth, water and fire. If we ignore this assumption, what we expect to arise from water is not fire, but vapor, steam or air. That Heraclitus means us to understand something of the sort is clear not only from the parallel to Anaximenes' doctrine of the soul, but from the ancient testimony concerning Heraclitus' own view, which uniformly states that the soul is to be explained as an exhalation, anaphemiosis, or breath, pneuma. Furthermore, this view is decisively confirmed by the fragments that describe the psyche as becoming either moist or dry. Such statements make sense for a breath of exhalation, but not for a fire. Among the ancient sources which report Heraclitus' view of the soul as vapor or exhalation, the most interesting is an indirect quotation from Cleanthes, who links this view to the image of the cosmic river. Heraclitus likened souls to rivers when he said, "As men step into the same river, other and other waters flow upon them, and souls too are exhaled from moisture." Fragment 12, end of quote. Although, and this is interesting, I fell for the same mistake, and I think there must be thousands of interpreters of Heraclitus who has done this mistake. Although Heraclitus' river is usually interpreted as a general reference to elemental transformation, this ancient author believes that it refers to the soul. In a sense, he must be right. Where referring solely to the elements, what would be the point of men stepping in? This intrusion of the human participant gives the notion of identity in flux an immediate and concrete significance. If our soul is an exhalation, it too is an on-flowing process, and it may well be that a river into which we cannot step twice, it is psychophysical flux of our own lives and experience. In a larger sense, the river certainly refers to changes throughout the universe. But the notion of the soul as an exhalation from moisture also links it to a larger cycle of elemental transformation, to the upward path from earth to water to vapor, and eventually on to fire. This is the road of life for the soul. The road downwards is that of death. For Heraclitus, the identity of life and death must be understood in an intimate connection with the identity of the way up and the way down. In physical language, the way up is that of the dry souls, which are drawing nearer to fire. The way down is that of the moist, who is perishing into water. I think that's a very good analogy. The way down, when water or the moisture goes into water, it disperses. It loses its identity. It loses its permanence. And I think this is what happens today. When we linger on to life, we lose. We get sucked up in water, and we get so diluted so that no longer is a soul or a direction. Welcome to the modern condition of man. We are perpetually dissolved into the water because our insistence on keeping only to one part, life over death usually, summer over winter, light over darkness, and so on. And then we lose it all. We get dispersed in water, and once the soul gets moist, it dissolves, ceases to exist, like a sugar cube put into the sea. It gets dispersed. For Heraclitus, the identity of life and death In a larger sense, the river certainly refers to changes throughout the universe, but the notion of the soul as an exhalation from moisture also links it to a larger cycle of elemental transformation, to the upward path from earth to water to vapor, eventually onto fire. This is the road of life for the soul. The road downwards is that of death. For Heraclitus, the identity of life and death must be understood in intimate connection with the identity of the way up and the way down. In the physical language, the way up is that of the dry souls, which are drawing nearer to fire. The way down is that of the moist who are perishing into water. How magnificent! What a quote! In moral and psychological terms, the way down is the life of pleasure, passion, drunkenness, and dissolution. The way up is that by which souls become best and wisest. With his characteristic rigor, Heraclitus identifies the conflicting human tendencies toward wisdom and sensual pleasure with the opposing courses of elemental transformation. On this view, an unimaginable surprise is in store for men when they die. What will happen to those who sate themselves like cattle is clear enough. They simply pass into the inert elements, water and earth. But greater fates are reserved for greater depths, and the nobler destiny certainly connotes a movement upwards, to smoke perhaps, and ultimately to fire. It can only be these nobler souls, the kinsmen of fire, who rise up and become wakeful watchmen of the living and the dead. The task which Hesiod assigned to the golden race of mortals after their death. The mass of mankind clearly has a lower fate. They wish only to live and die, or what is the same thing, to beget children. This is the life and death, of rest and sleep, the polar opposite of the watchful waking. Thus a man's character is his daemon, not only his deity but his divine guardian, his fate in the world and the next. It is simply and directly by their passage back and forth into the elements that mortals are immortal, immortals mortal, living the other's death and dead in their life. Lifetime, Ion, is the royal player moving the pieces back and forth in a game whose rules are those of the cosmos. It is war, polemos, the struggle of opposing tendencies up and down, which assigns everyone his place, God or man, slave or free. This fragment that asserts the supreme role of war, as father of all and king of all, fragment 53, is the exact inverse of fragment 30 of the world order as ever-living fire. This cosmos is made by neither man nor God, rather is the cosmic struggle itself that makes both gods and men. We note that the term God is thus used by Heraclitus in two senses. First, there are the immortals in the plural, who, like the mortals with whom they exchange roles, are only stations or stages in the cosmic course. The so-called elements and world constituents of every kind. But there is also the God in the singular, who is compared to fire and equated with war and peace, who is the one divine source of all human laws, the thunderbolt who pilots all, the one wise alone, who is and is not the same as Zeus. There is a suggestive parallel between this heno, polytheism, and the position of Xenophanes, whose one God is the greatest among gods and men. But as soon as this distinction between many gods and the one God has been drawn, its limitations must be recognized, because this limits everything. It's the same as holon and anholon. For Heraclitus, all things are one, and the unity which includes night and day also comprehends mortals, immortals, and the one wise and alone, even if the latter is in some sense set apart from all else. It is set apart not only because it is of a higher logical type, the whole which comprehends the parts, but also because it dominates the rest. The unity of wisdom consists in the insight how all things are steered through all things. The exact wording of this fragment is uncertain, but the sense surely is that cosmic guidance is a function of cosmic intelligence. Yet the statement seems to be intentionally ambiguous. And to point both to the uniqueness of the supreme wisdom and at the same time to the possibility of human insight into the cosmic patterns. This ambiguity is implicit in the term sophos itself, which can denote technical competence, practical wisdom, theoretic knowledge, and divine omniscience. This ambiguity is artfully exploited by Heraclitus in a series of ambivalent assertions. It is wise, listening not to me but to the Logos, to agree that all things are one. Of those whose logo I have heard, no one has come so far as this, to recognize that the wise is set apart from all else. The wise is one to master the insights how all things are steered through all things. The wise is one alone, willing and unwilling to be called by the name of Zeus. It is clear that in the first of these four statements, wisdom is a quality expected of Heraclitus' audience, while in the fourth case it is identified with a unique divine principle. The second and third statement are ambiguous, and the commentators disagree as to whether they should be taken as applying to the wisdom of man or God. But such debate is pointless, since Heraclitus has been at some point pains to make the strict dichotomy impossible. As we have seen, even in the first of these four assertions, the wisdom of the intelligent hearer consists in an agreement with the Logos, that is, in congruence with the rational unity of things. The distinction between the knowing subject and the known object, like between man and God, has only a relative, not an absolute significance for Heraclitus. Very important. This is once more holon and unholon. The whole and the not whole, they are related. And everything that is not the whole, what is around it, and what is not it, it is part of both the whole and not the whole. This is a conclusion that, of course, Bertrand Russell never entered into, and I would say it's mighty important. It shows we cannot gain knowledge without this understanding. Otherwise, the measures we take on understanding will by itself limit the understanding that can be reached. And this logos is a logos that is between the split, before the split of logos and mythos. That is the source. And if you stick with only logos, you will never ever gain anything. The knowledge you have at that instance when the split takes place or is taking place, because that itself is also a process. Your logos, your knowing, your Sophia, your knowledge will diminish every hour, every day, every week, month, year. It will be lesser and lesser and lesser. One could say there is no real antidote to that lessening. It will continue and continue. And this is what's happening in the modern academic world. We all got the knowledge you used to have at some certain instant, and the only thing you can do is rename it. And as long as this process goes on, your knowledge will dissolve like the soul getting moist, and therefore it disperses into the water like a spoon of salt put into the thalassa, into the big river or the ocean or a river. It disperses, it gets less. And if you die in that instant, you would just be transformed to earth and water, earth and mud. The change can only be done in physical, psychical life. But once it's been begun, it can grow larger and larger. And I would say that there is no actual limit to this growth. So not only is Heraclitus pointing to a way to further your life, to make yourself permanent in life, and therefore also in the afterlife. He also shows the way to knowledge. I would say that's the most important message. You avoid dispersion. It becomes possible for you to grow also, to get more permanent. I think one of the problems with the idea of the soul as a blob or a huge lump, an existence, is the problem in itself. That's the kernel of the poodle, nowhere else. This soul is a process. The soul of Heraclitus is a fire, is progressing. It's a process. And the only thing that can be stable is a process. And existence is in itself impermanent. Therefore, I also think, Pantarei, everything flows. You can never step into the same river twice, the same place. It's a very important message. So staying at one point means also a decision not to approach knowledge. It can be no learning anymore if you define knowledge as the opposite to not knowing. And it can be no truth if you decide that truth is what is not false. And this seemed to be a cosmic order rather than a decision from gods or a god. God is not a judge over this process. It is something that we partially, unbeknownst, we choose ourselves. And it takes years, it takes decades, it takes centuries. it takes eons to understand, further, and develop. An ongoing eternal trend is offered by Heraclitus, and it's a true offering. It is not scarce of turning into mud and earth. That is trying to explain how it all works. He is helpful. He is a true master. Could be called a pandit or a sensei, maybe, something like that. Very wise, and a wise man whose words should not be listened to directly or just repeated. They should be practiced, because all these verb forms, all this action, all this movement means it should be a movement in your life if you want permanence. And he doesn't criticize staticness. It's quite all right, but you have to see for it what it is, what it makes with you. It's not a critique. There will always exist staticness. When the knowledge is low enough, you will be static. I would say that it is most definitely unavoidable. Here as elsewhere there is a logos, a ratio, linking the opposed terms. Man is to God as a child, or an ape in fragments 82 to 83 is to man. The respective parts of the wisdom or folly assigned to the child, man and God, represent proportionate shares in a single reality. This gradient scale, which is very important on knowledge, which reaches from 0 point of total darkness and sleep to the maximum intensity of divine insight, coincides with the scale of being itself that stretches from the inert nadir of earth to the ardent zenith of the ever-living flame. Only a flame can be alive. A soul in the modern take can never ever be either permanent nor alive. But a flame is a process. That is also very important, moving. Another name for the unifying order of the world is Dike. And we have seen how Heraclitus adapts Anaximander's concept of cosmic justice to bring up the older sense of Dike as a concrete principle directly applicable in the affairs of men. Dike will lay hands on false witnesses and forgers of lies. Fragment 28. In so doing, she acts as an exact parallel to the oncoming fire, which will judge and lay hands on all things. Fragment 66. For how will one hide from that which never sets? Fragment 16. Fire here takes over the traditional mythical function of the all-seeing sun, while the epithet oncoming suggests a parallel to the unflowing waters of the river. In fact, the judgment of fire and the law enforcement of dike are both identical with the cosmic process itself. The goddess who punishes liars is the same as who regulates the course of the sun. Very good. Here you see the laws and the laws of the nature being the same. Our Christian sources naturally interpret the judgment of fire by reference to the end of the world, but such was not Heraclitus' meaning, even if as I believe he conceived of a periodic reabsorption of all things into the ever-living fire. For at that point the fate of hero and coward would be exactly the same. The justice of the world order is rather a continuous, immanent aspect of the cosmic process throughout. It is identical with the movement of all things up and down. The soul, as a spirit of vaporous exhalation, participates by its own nature in the movement upwards to fire. The rare man with insight who understands each thing according to its nature and as it is. Fragment 1. The rare man with insight who understands each thing according to its nature and as it is, end of fragment, will identify himself with his spontaneous tendency, for it constitutes his real self. If by his life and deeds he has chosen fire as his daemon, it will lead him, like a faithful psychopomp, to its abode in the house of the dead, which in this case is the realm of the increased life. The path of most men, on the other hand, who sell their souls for pleasure and passion, is the way down to moisture and extinction. Thus Heraclitus is a mystic, perhaps, but his eschatology involves none of the dualism that is so conspicuous in Empedocles. For the latter, as a true Orphic, the world of elemental change is a hostile abode. The incarnation of the deathless daemon means the putting on of an alien garment of flesh. Very interesting, Empedocles. In such a view, the cycle of transmigration is necessarily limited to the forms of living things. Heraclitus remains truer, after all, to the spirit of Ionian physics than to the salvation cults of the West, and for him transmigration is of different type altogether. It is not as creatures of a higher order that men participate in this mystic cycle. Their death and rebirth is that of the elements and the cosmos as well. It is not as creatures of a higher order that men participate in this mystical cycle. Their death and rebirth is that of the elements and of the cosmos as well. The greater portions allotted to the greater souls lie within the mundane order, not beyond it. The human soul transmigrates in the same way as earth and water. How clever! This is what you can call true wisdom. I guess you can think of it as of moral laws, so to speak, what was previously in an anterior place, anteriori, were made to be the power. Part of the power was used to make the physis, the laws of the physicos. From there come their stamina, and thereby they got diluted. They became what they were not. The physical laws somehow became lesser, since they were defined in exclusion to the moral laws. And of course the same goes for the moral laws. Today we're even trying to derive the moral laws from the physical laws, or the physical arche, or something like that. This is not true to the sake, because a moral world and a physical world is the same thing for Heraclitus. They are opposing pairs, but the superposition contains them both and more. It contains the power to designate what is good and what is bad. From there comes the power to designate what is summer and what is winter. You can see how that is much grander, how much more encompassing, much more powerful. Whereas the little soul of now, the soul as existence, in contrast to non-existence of the soul, and living only in contrast to non-living, dead, is such smaller and choiceless thing. It becomes something you could call static. But static doesn't really exist. Pantare really means pantare. It means that it's just blocking off, shielding off, not taking in, being limiting, being an obstruction, being not knowing, and being impermanence. Yet the way of the soul is, after all, not quite the same. Earth and water presumably have no choice as to their course of transformation. In the case of man, however, the tone of Heraclitus's entire discourse presupposes a dimension of moral insight and choice, of wisdom and folly, or as a modern would say, of inner freedom. Like Spinoza and like the Stoics, Heraclitus assumes that the principle of moral autonomy is compatible with a rigorously monistic scheme. But beyond the Stoics and beyond nearly all thinkers of classical age, Heraclitus is acutely aware of the specific character of psychic reality as such, with its characteristic dimension of inwardness. It would be difficult to find another philosopher before late antiquity who could say, "I sought myself," that is, I went in search of my soul. It is this new and rare sense for the human soul as an inner world, or as containing the secret of the universe within itself, which Heraclitus expresses in his denial that one can find the ends of the soul by going even if you travel over every way, so deep in its logos. A similar thought seems to be expressed in his mention of the logos of the soul, which increases itself, fragment 115, and which presumably might go on increasing until it merges itself in the total logos, in the life and death of the universe. Heraclitus appears to be struggling for the first time in history with the paradox of Pascal, that man is a thinking reed, so frail that he may be easily crushed, yet lifted above the universe by his own consciousness of his weakness and mortality. Par l'espace, l'univers me comprend et me m'engloutit comme un point. Par la pensée, je le comprends. And I quote. Probably no philosophy has fully resolved this paradox, and certainly Heraclitus would not have been satisfied with the neat Cartesian dualism. The novelty, but above all the intrinsic difficulty of the problem he was confronting, accounts for his intense sentiment of the hidden character of truth he proclaims. There is no doubt that, in a tent, his monism is as thoroughgoing as he could make it. It extends not only to the general unity of opposites and to the fusion of mystic eschatology with elemental physics, but also to the identity of thinking subject and physical object within the divine unity itself. But here we must distinguish between the real unity which Heraclitus is trying to describe and the specific identity of different symbols by which he refers to it. It is easy to say, and I think profoundly misleading, to say that God, fire, the Logos, war, Dike, and the Wise One are equivalent terms for Heraclitus. Each one is rather a sign, you remember that? A sign that points to one aspect of an entity for which there is no single adequate formula, and which Heraclitus's whole discourse strains to express by every device at his command. The fitting together which he is asserting throughout is essentially hidden, and therefore only riddled paradox and elusive wordplay can do it justice. To speak plainly about such a subject would be to falsify it in the telling. How very good! If you express it clearly, you falsify it thereby. That is the knowledge side of nullification for Rudolf Gachet. Everyone who clearly expresses truth is falsifying it. It is making it distinct by telling what it is not. Indirectly or directly, truth becomes something much less. It becomes something impermanent, becomes something that dissolves in water. It becomes not strong, weak, and to be abandoned, and to be diminished, and to, at the end, dissolve and goes into dung and earth, never to be seen again. Or rather, to be honest, reincarnate into earth and dung. Sometimes, and I think the philosophers, especially Xenophonus, make the horrendous mistake of thinking God is in charge of these things. This is how the universe works. It's not a physis. It's not the natural law. And by replacing the world of God with physical law, which I think happened early on, it is the so-called trap of the Milesians, which I call the trap of the Milesians, but is without Heraclitus it is absolutely inevitable. You cannot avoid it, and thereby you diminish God to be the judge of the transmigration, of the fluctuations, and thereby you make God so much less, because these things are how it works without laws, where your intention, your moral intention, your attitude and the physical laws are exactly the same. But saying that God is the guardian of these laws is diminishing him. God is greater, is beyond that. And by understanding how we can learn from physical/moral laws, we get closer to God, because God does not rule that. In a way, this makes the Newtonian God true of the deistic, but at the same time it is not the same, because this God is much grander to participate in something that was made by a contradiction, a paradox, or contradistinction is the word. Contradistinction emanating from the discovery/theorizing of the polymaths of the Ionian coasts, the Milesians. We all fall into that trap, and honest to God to say that is true. Hence Heraclitus is consciously and unavoidably obscure. So now you see how Aristotle did not understand Heraclitus. And similarly, it would be a betrayal on the part of the interpreter to force Heraclitus's language and imagery out of its bewildering complexity into any simple and straightforward doctrine. The most we can do is to define the respective range of the various symbols he employs, and that is what has been attempted here for fire, war, justice, and the upward and the downward path. When I say, therefore, that in Heraclitus's conception of the divine unity of things, the knowing subject and the physical object coalesce, I mean that his use of the term wise, sophon, in this connection implies that the cosmic order symbolized by fire and war is thought of as in some sense aware of its own structure, and that this awareness in turn is comparable to human insight, in which Heraclitus's own logos is meant to convey. What wisdom-loving men, philosophoi andres, in fragment 35, are ultimately seeking is the total insight into deity. The term logos, on the other hand, does not denote this insight as such, but rather the structure which it apprehends, according to which all things come to pass, a structure of rational measure and proportion expressible in discourse. Fire is the visible symbol of this order, of which the wise is in turn the rational apprehension. God, Theos, for Heraclitus is the least precise term of the series. It's the final predicate of supremacy bestowed upon a nature defined by other terms. It points to the total unity underlying logos, fire, wisdom, and all other aspects of this divine whole, including the two complementary notions of justice and warfare, dike και πολέμος. Thus the power of Heraclitus' synthesis resides not only in the rigorous simplicity of his monism, but also in the intricate complexity of the web of symbols by which, like Apollo, he manifests his meaning. It is not only the artistry with which they are articulated, but the depth and suggestiveness of the signs themselves that make Heraclitus so extraordinarily relevant to the intellectual trends of our own age. We may therefore close with one specific sign or image whose use by Heraclitus makes him almost our contemporary, while it reveals at the same time the inner unity of his own thought. I mean here his reference to sleep and dreaming. Other philosophers like Descartes or Plato in the Theaetetus have cited the experience of an alien world which opens up before the dreamer in order to raise the question of reality of what surrounds us in our waking life. Primitive thought everywhere recognizes the dream experience as a possible road of access to the realm of the divine or of the dead. Heraclitus invokes both of these attitudes, the awe of the primitive as well as the scorn of the epistemologist, but he does so with a multiple resonance that can scarcely be matched except by a modern poet or a philosophic novelist. French quote here, I hope there is a... I'll have to read it in French. Maybe, Kalle, you can provide me with a translation and I'll put it into the description later on. Tout à coup, je m'endormais, je tombais dans ces sommeils lourds où se déroulant pour nous le retour à la jeunesse, la reprise des années passées, des sentiments perdus, la désincarnation, la transmigration des âmes, la évocation des morts, les illusions de la folie, la régression vers les règles les plus élémentaires de la nature. Car on dit que nous voyons souvent des animaux en rêve, mais on oublie que presque toujours nous y sommes nous-mêmes un animal, dérivé de cette raison qui projette sur les choses une clarté de certitude. Nous n'ignorons au contraire au spectacle de la vie qu'une vision douteuse et à chaque minute anéantis par l'oubli. Tous ces mystères que nous croyons ne pas connaître et auxquels nous sommes en réalité initiés presque toutes les nuits, ainsi qu'à l'autre grand mystère de l'anéantissement et de la résurrection. End of French quote there. It is something of this mysterious, rich and imprecise revelation of the dream world that Heraclitus evokes. Such a significance is only latent when, at the very beginning of his work, Heraclitus compares the waking thoughtlessness of most men to the oblivion of the sleeper, or the narrow vision of the crowd to the private world of slumber, both of them deprived of that universal character which is the stamp of reason and reality. But even in sleep, one does not escape from the cosmos, since all things are one, since the unity of the Logos is all-pervasive. The dream world too is an aspect of this universal order. It is simply the region where fire is most nearly quenched, where the link with the common is particularly unstable. Death is everything we see awake. All we see asleep is sleep. Fragment 21. And man strikes a light for himself in the night, when his sight is quenched. The living grasp the dead asleep, the waking grasp the sleeping. If what we see in the waking world is death, the death of fire, presumably, as well of soul which has passed into the elements, the sleeping world does not present us with deaths reciprocal, life as the parallelism of the clauses in fragment 21 would lead us to expect. On the contrary, the sleepers enters into an even more intimate contact with the realm of the dead, as dreams have always testified. In a place of light of vision, another lamp is kindled for man who sleeps, an illumination which can only be that of the soul itself. How grand! The soul is the link by which the waking grasps the sleeping grasps the dead. Thus the dream experience is one more revelation of the endlessness of the soul. One cannot find its limits, for there is no region in death or in life to which the soul does not travel, waking or asleep. And now you see the power of the process. It's so far from existence, a stain that later got established. It is not constricted, it's not stoppable, it is determined, it has a direction. Direction is movement. We discussed also earlier how E.M. Gilchrist in his first book, The Master and His Emissary, took up these tendencies and said that in the earlier writings of the Iliad and the Odyssey, everything was verbal, everything was action. Even to see something, a color, or pointing something to what later became an object, was all in the verb. Later translator has said in the verb, object and subject was included. No, no, no. The other one is more encompassing, and by saying that the object and the subject was included is to diminish it, to exclude it, to make it something that will go into water and dissolve. This is taking away of all knowledge. This is not as This is not a small, horrible thing to do. This is a big, horrible thing to do. By so thinking, so understanding, it's an attitude of things where everything is already divided or cut short or diminished or contracted, frictionized, tensed, made smaller. Behold the greatness of the ever-living. This is the true God, not the ruler of the excluded cosmic laws, the natural laws, which put into the picture, into the equation, a diminishment, exclusion, inflation in the bad sense, diminishing, and thereby making God, soul and human beings into dissolvable in water, like a spoon of salt thrown into the sea dissolves, disperses. Whereas it doesn't completely cease to exist, it becomes more like mud, earth, and very much less like fire. But the true up includes down. The true good includes evil, but it's beyond, it's more, much more than just good or God in contrast. I hope that makes sense, and I say thank you very much for a fantastic time here at the Agiasma Apostolo Paulo. Thank you, and have a very nice afternoon. Bye bye for now.